Shell Cordovan is the Rolex of leathers. Hey guys, what is going on? So in the video today, I'm going to be comparing the different Shell Cordovans from a few different tanneries. I've scoured the internet for resources on this and I can't find any good ones. Nothing is concrete when it comes to Shell Cordovan. Obviously, the most popular Shell Cordovan in the world is Horween's Shell Cordovan, but there are other tanneries that make shell, such as Rocado shell, Shinki, Cloe shell, and Maryam shell. There are others, but I don't have boots from those other tanneries, so I can only compare what I have here today. Before I get started, I've done a little bit of research as to how people grade leathers, how they rate and grade leathers, similar to how you rate and assess wines when you taste it based on the flavor profile, the complexity, how long it was aged in a barrel for, all these things, the climate it was produced in and all this. It's gonna have a little bit of a different effect on the wine. Same thing with leather. Every tannery does it a little bit different. The good news is we do have one constant, which is we're dealing with the Shell Cordovan layer, which is the subcutaneous portion of the horse's rump.
Today we talk about, can you guess? Horse.
So what is shell? So I mentioned my horse butt to Shell Cordovan comparison video, and that ruffled some feathers. You know, I broke it down to how shell is actually not a skin, it's the hyaline layer beneath the skin. I found some more resources on this. Yes, it is the hyaline layer. This is from Lord Point Shoemaker in 2013. I'll leave the link to this article below. So there's a lot of misconceptions, but they stem from trying to understand horsehide in terms of bovine biology, whereas the truth is that horses have a third layer of skin, and they are quite unique in this regard. I finally started to find concrete information about this third layer in a book published in 1923 by the Chemical Catalog Company on the chemistry of leather manufacture, which contains a few snippets about Shell Cordovan. I found this one particularly interesting. Thank you, historians. The dense mass of fibers, often called the glassy layer, yes, Shell Cordovan is often glassy, can be seen running horizontally across the middle of the picture and appearing much darker than the remaining fibers. The portion of the hide containing the glassy layer is known as the shell. It is used to make leather sold under the name of Cordovan. This glassy layer, also called the horse mirror, is more properly called the hyaline or hyaline layer, which separates the epidermis from the corium. The hyaline is a layer of skin present in all mammals in which the fibers become so tightly woven that there are no loose ends beneath the epidermis. Thus, when the epidermis is removed, a smooth layer is revealed called the hyaline layer, which gives the characteristic grain surface to leather. As mentioned above, however, the hyaline in horses is unusually dense to the point that it takes on a glassy appearance. Furthermore, a horse's hyaline is not only dense, but also incredibly thick. So much so that rather than simply from a surface as it does in other mammals, it helps make up an entire different layer of skin so unique to horses that is sometimes called the Cordovan layer. This layer actually covers a large area of the horse's body, but is so especially dense around the horse's rump, or crup, that it was designated the shell. Interesting. I didn't know that the horse had this all over its body. This is a really good write-up from Pure Polish, and I will also leave a link to this in the description below. My original research led me to believe that Cordovan shell was produced from a part of the subcutaneous muscle layer in horses called the panniculus carnosus. This is a thin, fibrous twitch muscle lining the abdomen and hind quarter of the horse. But in reality, Cordovan shell is made of a collagen protein-based tissue structure that is a cross between flesh and cartilage called the hyaline layer that exists specifically on the rump of a horse between the epidermis and the corium. This layer does not exist in cow skin. Because this layer is a dense, smooth layer of tissue, it is also referred to as the glassy layer. Once the horse leather is cut down to the ovals that contain the hyaline tissue layer, the epidermis is shaved off of the hyaline layer, leaving no grain side. This is one of the reasons that it is hot stuffed rather than fat liquored. Hot stuffing allows the tannery to add a lot more fats and waxes than fat liquoring. Because the additional fats and waxes, another aspect plays an even bigger role: the difference between the structure of the skin tissue and the hyaline layer tissue. Both skin and the hyaline layer are made up of protein filament bundles, known as fibrils. but the shape and size of the filaments differ quite a bit. A collagen protein filament in skin is about 80 nanometers in diameter, while the filaments in the hyaline layer have a bulbous head that is about 12 nanometers in diameter, and a filament that tapers to much smaller. These tapered filaments fold over onto themselves, causing denser tissue. The filament size in the hyaline layer is similar in relative size to an actin protein filament found in the muscle, which is about 8 nanometers in diameter. This perpetuates some of the confusion around Cordovan shell being a muscle rather than a skin tissue, because the fibrils in the hyaline layer are so much more compressed, 10 filaments for every one of cowhide, and folded over as well. It tends to retain oil and wax much better. This compressed fibrous tissue has no real grain side, and so it acts like flesh-out leather, similar to waxed leather, but a much more compressed surface. This is also why a smooth deer bone can rub out a scuff. Since Cordovan shell retains waxes and oils so well, it does not need to be conditioned very often. One would say the Cordovan shell never needs conditioning. However, all oils oxidize over time and should be replenished as needed. I've got a few pairs of boots here to talk about, and I'm going to rate these on 3 criteria, which is density, sheen, and translucence. Those are my criteria. I picked those out of the air. I don't know how else to rate these leathers. If there are any leather experts in the comments below, please shed some light. If you've collected different Shell Cordovan samples from different tanneries, please leave a comment, let us know, because I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to spread knowledge, and I'm trying to unravel the mystery myself here. Let's go left to right. So here are some iron boots in brown Maryam Shell Cordovan. These are my Renav Goods engineer boots in Cloe crust Shell Cordovan. These two are my Grant Stone Edward boots, Horween's Shell Cordovan, Maduro Shell Cordovan, and Honey Glaze Shell Cordovan. And then we have my Junkard boots, Junkard service boots in green Shell Cordovan from the Rocado tannery. And then here we have Junkard service boots in blue Shell Cordovan from Shinki. And here we have my Mark Albert boots in also Shinki Shell Cordovan whiskey color. So let's first assess these all by density. Measuring the thickness on all these might not be helpful because some of these have linings, but these iron boots, the thickness on these is 4.5 ounces shell. On the crust shell, it is 5 ounces. On the Grant Stone shell, I believe this is also 5 ounces. This has a lining, this has a lining, this has a lining. So I can't really measure the thicknesses of these 3. However, the density is super tight on all these. Why? Because it's shell. That's the nature of Shell Cordovan. The fiber density is super duper dense on all of these. Not to the credit of the tanneries, but rather to the credit of the animal that it comes from, the subcutaneous layer of the horse.
That's the sound of horse.
It is the most non-porous leather in the world. It's basically waterproof. I mean, it still absorbs water, but it's very, very hardy stuff. Next, I'm gonna talk about the sheen. By far, Horween wins on the sheen front. The Horween Shell Cordovan definitely has a higher gloss, and it's not just because they were conditioned. There's something about it that lends itself to having a different quality about it that has a much higher gloss. The crust shell is not a good comparison because the crust shell actually has a nubuck appearance when it's new. It almost has a fuzziness, almost a suede like texture when it's brand new. Now these have been heavily conditioned with Venetian, and so for that reason the gloss has actually been enhanced on the crust shell. The gloss on the Maryam, it is there, but it's not as glossy as the Horween stuff. It's just a little bit more matte in feeling as compared to the Horween stuff. The Horween stuff is very, very definitely shiny, almost plasticky to the feel, whereas this Maryam shell, it feels like leather. The Cloe crust shell, it's a little bit closer to Horween's Shell Cordovan. Again, that's after having Venetian applied. The Rocado has a pretty decent gloss. I'd give it an 8.5 gloss, whereas Horween would be a 10. Same with Shinki. Shinki and Rocado, nearly indistinguishable from one another. Yeah, these Mark Alberts, after having broken in and not having been conditioned, they're starting to reveal some more character. The gloss has definitely dropped off. So these on the fully unpatinated portions have probably a 7.5 gloss out of 10, I would say. And then on the really broken in vamp breaks here. It's very matte in appearance. It's definitely lost a lot of its gloss. And then there's some scratches along the vamp here. And finally, I'll talk about translucence. So these iron boots in Maryam brown shell, these are not translucent at all. One of the characteristics of Horween shell is you could almost peer into it, like color 8 shell. You could almost peer into the depths of it. It almost draws you in. It's kind of a bizarre phenomenon, but when it's super shined up, it's almost like you get vertigo looking at it, because you can't really tell where the grain begins. You can't really tell how deep you're peering into this stuff. It looks like you're peering into the depths. The Cloe crust shell has a little bit of depth since adding Venetian to it. I can see sort of into it, but not nearly as much as I can see into the Horween stuff. The Horween stuff, it's like you're peering through layers of glass almost, especially on the honey glazed shell, very much so. And then in the Rocado, it's a little bit more translucent than the Maryam stuff. I still wouldn't put it as being as translucent as Horween shell, for example. And then the Shinki stuff, this whiskey shell is not translucent at all. Let's talk about the obvious differences between these leathers. So my buddy Jake at Almost Vintage Style, he coined the term earthy when it comes to Horween shell. Horween shell does have a very earthy appearance. Horween is very good at achieving earthier tones, whereas Shinki is better at achieving very rich and vibrant tones. And that becomes obvious when you're looking at the Rocado as well. All three of these are very, very vibrant leathers. And so obviously they're doing something cosmetically. Horween is doing something more, I think, in terms of quality tanning, whereas Shinki and Rocado, they're also doing quality, but I think their focus is more on the cosmetic appearance, if that makes sense, because you can just see in this green and in this blue and in this whiskey, they're just popping out at you with color. And that's not something you're ever going to see out of Horween. The colors are always very muted, very earthy. To caveat the earthy tones of the Horween leather, there is a huge sore thumb that sticks out while in the midst of editing this video. Horween has what's called ultraviolet Shell Cordovan. Now, I don't know if this undergoes the same tanning processes, but this is just a wild shade. It's such a wild, vibrant shade of magenta / ultraviolet. It is truly eye-popping. I don't think I'd feel good wearing that color. It's, you know, if I'm being honest, it's probably better for like a women's boot. That's not to say that guys can't rock it either. You know, I have purple boots, but that magenta ultraviolet color is maybe a little bit on the feminine side for me. That one is definitely the odd duck in the group. It's definitely the red-headed stepchild, or should I say the ultraviolet headed stepchild of the bunch, because while all the other Horween colors, such as Ravello, Color 2, Color 4, Color 6, Color 8, Cigar, Dark Brown, all these colors of Horween shell very much are sort of just like, by my eye, a combination of reds and browns added to create overall very earthy appearance. Garnet is a very vibrant like red, but still it's not over the top red. It's not red like this. It's actually red more like a ruby color. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's not that vibrant color. To achieve these vibrant colors and to keep these vibrant colors, you need more of a chemical process to take place, less of a natural process. Beautiful in their own right. The Cloe, not a good comparison because this is an undyed natural leather. I don't know as far as Cloe goes. I have a hunch that it's going to be more earthy once I start talking about the next thing that I'm going to talk about. This Maryam is somewhere in between Shinki and Horween, I would say. The Maryam seems to be a little bit more earthy than these two Rocado and Shinki makers, but I think it's also very earthy in its own right. I'm going to talk about why. So here are 3 horse rump boots. These are my Tahura boots in Cloe olive horse rump. These are my Truman boots. These are both Truman boots. This is in Maryam Tuscanello, and this is in Maryam Navy horse rump. Now, what can you see based on this? What I see is, let's look at Maryam first. Not super duper vibrant tannages. So in other words, what I'm getting at here is I believe that the horse rump and the shell at Maryam are they probably have some of the same tannages involved, the same pigments, some of the same processes probably. They probably treat their leathers as part of the same family. You know, they have their own procedures and processes that they take all their leathers through, and it's going to reflect in the horse rump onto the Shell Cordovan. And so for that reason, what you can see here is both of these browns are very, very similar, I think. By my eye, they're both very earthy. Again, this is Maryam horse rump, Maryam Shell Cordovan. And then this navy, as you can see, this navy horse rump compared to the Shinki is so much more vibrant, right? This navy's a lot more muted out, a little bit more earthy, if you want to call it that. Much less bold, much less vibrant. This stuff is, I mean, it's eye-poppingly in your face, bold blue. That's an example of Shinki versus Maryam. So I think, yeah, once again, Shinki is very good at achieving those really rich, vibrant colors. Whereas I think Maryam, they seem to have more earthy colors in their pigmentation process, is what I'm getting at here. All right, so let's talk about Cloe now. So this is Cloe olive horse rump once again, and this is Cloe crushed shell cordovan. And what I'm seeing here is very similar to Maryam. Cloe seems to focus more on natural tanning methods. They're trying to be environmentally friendly, and for that reason, their pigments just aren't as vibrant. They're a little bit more muted out, a little bit more earthy. And so that's, using this as an example, that's why I think Cloe Tannery is also dealing in more earthier colors. You compare this green to the Rocado. I mean, look at that. This Rocado green shell is just exploding with color. And so for that reason, I like to use the horse rump sometimes as a reflection onto the Shell Cordovan to get an assessment and a gauge for how they tan these leathers. This is a lot of conjecture. This is a lot of analysis on my part. I'm just going by what I see and what I can read, doing research on the internet and whatnot, and that's my assessment. Every tannery does their process just a little different. They're working with the same materials, but you got to take into account, where are they sourcing these hides from? Where are these animals coming from? What was the climate they were in? What was their diet? And then not just that, what does the tannery do with the hides once they get them? Every tannery has a different process. Horween, obviously, they're doing something very special with their shell. I really like the Horween shell, but I love all the shell. Every tannery has achieved something amazing in their own right, but I think it's very fascinating comparing the different shells from different tanneries. All right, so editing me is back. So I realized very quickly that I would have been a fool had I not consulted with my friend Phil Callis at Ashland Leather, who, by the way, just started a new podcast called the Full Grain Podcast. I've had Phil on my channel before. He is a true leather expert. The reason why I say he's a true leather expert is because he will be upfront in telling you that he doesn't know everything. So for example, in his podcast, he actually has Nick Horween on a lot, and he actually just did a podcast with Nick Horween's dad, Skip. They were just mulling over the details, talking about the industry, talking about leather, truly illuminating. Every time I hear Phil speak, I learn just so much more about leather. And so I told him that I was doing this video. I will leave a link to his podcast in the description below. I highly recommend it. He is a wealth of leather knowledge. If you really like geeking out on leather, he is definitely a man to follow. With that said, I asked Phil about my 3 categories that didn't really seem to work out, right? I went by weight, translucence, and sheen, but then he actually added a few more to the discussion, which is temper, feel, and smell. I thought smell was a really good one. This is my bourbon shell wallet right here. Absolutely love this thing. This has been my go-to wallet for probably 2 years now. It's patinated up wonderfully. Horween shell is unique in that, in terms of smell, it comes with a very woodsy quality about the smell when it's brand new. It's got a very nice, almost cedar-like aroma, but even then it's more complex, I would say, but it definitely has a woodsy type smell profile to it. When this Shinki arrived from Mark Albert, it actually didn't have a smell, the Shinki stuff. Zero scent by my recollection. That's going to bring me to discussing the Cloe shell, the Shinki shell, and the Rocado shell. I haven't heard anybody talk about this, and I'm not trying to be offensive or anything, but actually all 3 of these kind of smell the same. In fact, all my Indonesian boots, regardless of what leather they are, all come with like it's like a strange, it's hard to describe. It's almost like a floral type of a scent. Even beyond that, it's not just floral. It almost smells almost like a cheap cologne. I don't know why that is. I don't know, but it's It's consistent among all Indonesian boots that I've got. Renav Goods, Imperium, Tahura, Benzene. They've all had this sort of floral, cheap cologne type smell to it. Now that dissipates very quickly after just a couple of wears. Yeah, I think the smell is pretty pleasant, don't get me wrong, but it's not a reflection of the leather. So I can't rate the smell on the Cloe, the Maryam, the Rocado, or the Shinki, because by my knowledge, they don't really have one. The Horween, however, definitely has a very robust woodsy smell about it, so that's good. Temper, it's really hard to assess temper by feel because it's going to be very subjective, not to mention it's also going to depend largely if there is a lining in these boots. I can't emphasize that enough. A lining is definitely going to detract from your true experience of the leather. I love a good glove lining. It really adds to the comfort, so that's not a ding at all against lined boots. I think lining is important in a lot of boots. That adds a lot of structure, adds thickness to it. But that said, these are my Aldens in black shell. I can't assess the temper very well from one to one because, for example, these are lined, these are unlined, and so the temper, I mean, just going by my gut feeling, my subjective feeling, I feel like the Horween temper is firmer. The Horween temper is probably like, if we're gonna do it on a 1 to 10, I'm probably gonna give Horween a 9. I'm gonna give Cloe an 8. I'm gonna give Shinki and Rocado 7s. Shinki and Rocado, seriously, I can't tell the difference between these two. By my estimation, this is the same type of Shell Cordovan. They probably do similar tanning processes, similar pigmentation processes to, again, achieve that rich, lustrous, vibrant glow that they have. Feel, yeah, the Horween shell feels smooth. This Cloe crust shell, after conditioning, feels basically identical. And then these three, the Shinki and the Rocado, feel identical as well. Okay, so actually the Rocado, and maybe this is just because these are brand new, unworn, but the Rocado do feel smoother than the Shinki. And the more worn the Shinki is, the more of a rougher feel that it has compared to the Horween. This Horween, it might not be a good example, but the Horween is smoother, much more glossier, much more smooth. Horween seems to age less dramatically and keep its original appearance more permanently. The Shinki is more delicate, seems to scratch easier. It looks more pristine and prettier than Horween when it's brand new. It rapidly loses that luster. So this is another big thing about how leather ages. I heard this recently, that all leather eventually ages into the same looking leather. I remember years ago I was at the Baltimore Science Museum. They had a mummy expo going on, and there was I think it was a Danish mummy of a king. It was like 500 years old. And I remember, this is before I even got into boots, but I was fascinated because it said, oh, he's wearing very high quality boots. Sure enough, this mummy had super high quality boots on. It's interesting because the archaeologists can't tell what color that leather was originally. Could have been black, could have been brown, could have been natural. Who knows? But the point being is that all leathers sort of fade into the same color eventually over time. Give it enough time. I will say that this is particularly true and particularly rapid for the Cloe and the Maryam leathers. They all appear to evolve into a brown over time. I strongly suspect that this is due to the natural pigments. Because of the natural pigments, the color fades to become more and more earthy over time. Think of tree leaves and how they are a vibrant green in the spring and summer, but then they fade into a yellow, a red, an orange, but ultimately brown, right? They all turn brown. That's because the brown and the orange and the yellow pigments, they're hiding behind the green. So once the green fades out, once all that chlorophyll fades out and dies off, it reveals the other colors that were hiding beneath it. It seems that all leathers have this tendency, but the naturally pigmented stuff, like the Cloe, like the Maryam, seems to evolve in this progression much more rapidly. And I'll put an example of what I'm talking about on the screen. I saw some Willys leather boots recently that started out like an olive green color, and they quickly color shifted into a brown. It's not the wear that caused this color shift. Rather, the same way leaves brown in the fall is probably the same chemical process taking place in those boots, because the natural tannins, right, they're probably using the same stuff from nature. They probably didn't use a chemical process to enhance and create a more permanent pigmentation, a more artificial but more permanent pigmentation. That's where we get into like what's best. Is chrome tanning best, or is veg tanning, doing it more natural, or doing it more with a chemical process. See, the thing is the chemical process is more effective at retaining that original color pigmentation, whereas the more natural you go, the more it's going to just fade into an earthier brown tone. A lot of people might think that it was the wear that caused those Willy Leathers boots to brown up the way that they did, but it's not. Well, the wear definitely contributes. In other words, if he had left those in the box, would they still be olive? Yes, they would. But it wasn't the wear itself. It was the oxidation and the breakdown that took place while wearing the boots. Really lets the air in, really lets the waxes and the oils within the upper to open up, to breathe, and ultimately to break down much more quickly. So my best guess is that, yes, if you left them in the box on the shelf for 50 years, you'd open them up, they'd be a different shade. They'd be much more brown. But once you start wearing them, it seems to really accelerate that browning process. So my green horsebutt, my Color 85 Trumans from Maryam, they started out like a very nice emerald, a minty green color, but then they also turn brown. But then I artificially dyed them into a turquoise so that would better hold its appearance. My green horsebutt from Maryam and from Cloe tanneries in Italy, which I think they're probably doing similar tannage processes. They both experience similar phenomena. When you look at pictures of these when they're brand new, dramatically different. These have really broken down, and I really like the experience and the process, but just know that these are going to lose their green much more quickly than the Rocado will. This Rocado shell is probably going to stay green for a very, very, very long time. All right, so in closing, leave me your thoughts in the comments below, guys. I'm trying to really understand these differences. I haven't found a whole lot of information on the differences between the shells from different tanneries. So if any of you have any good input, please let me know in the description below. Is Horween shell the best? It just comes down to you and your opinion. I think Horween shell is very, very good. It's definitely some of the best, but I think it's very fascinating comparing the different shells from different tanneries. So anyways, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed this content, and anyways, thanks a lot for watching. I'll see y'all in my next video. For your horse.